Hello, welcome to Inside Politics. My name is Anastasia Lavrina. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said on Monday that military operations against Iran will not lead to an endless war and that the objective is to destroy Tehran's missile systems, naval capabilities and broader security infrastructure. His statement comes as American and Israeli forces continue coordinated strikes on Iranian territory. According to the Pentagon, the operation is designed to significantly degrade Iran's military capacity while avoiding a prolonged ground conflict. Tehran is responding with retaliatory strikes targeting Israel, United States assets and locations across the Persian Gulf region. The escalation follows reports surrounding the assassination of Iran's supreme leader. And in response, Tehran declared heightened security measures. Air defense systems have been activated across multiple countries. Regional airspace restrictions remain in place. United States bases in the Middle East are operating at maximum defensive readiness. The Pentagon has confirmed that additional naval and air assets are being repositioned in the Gulf. American forces across the region remain on elevated alert. Global markets have reacted with volatility. Oil prices have surged amid concerns over supply disruptions and the security of key maritime routes. Today, we examine the military balance on the ground, Washington's strategic objectives, Tehran's next steps, and whether international pressure can prevent this confrontation from expanding into a broader regional war. Joining me now is Hamdi Rifai, Government Relations Executive Director for MOS Strategies and Foreign Affairs Analyst in Washington, D.C., United States. Hamdi, thank you so much for joining Inside Politics today. And let me start with a simple question. Let's say, what is your reaction to the statement delivered at the Pentagon today when it was mentioned that this operation against Iran will not lead to an endless war and have a specific objective to destroy Tehran's missile systems, naval capabilities, and broader security infrastructure?
It's very clear that there isn't a particular end goal or defined point at which this war will end. However, that doesn't mean that the Trump administration doesn't have well-defined objectives that it can use to determine when to pull back. When I say that, what I mean is they do want the defeat of the Iranian government. They do want the defeat of Hezbollah as a proxy of the Iranian government in Lebanon. They do want to see the threat to energy infrastructure, particularly through the Strait of Hormuz, come to an end. So they have clearly defined objectives, and they have already moved very quickly towards achieving those objectives. As we've seen, the Lebanese government, for the first time, has actually banned Hezbollah in Lebanon, and we're seeing that although there is an effect on energy and energy prices, we're seeing that that's already being countered. So there are objectives. There may not be a well-defined end game. However, there is a path that they're proceeding down. As Pete Hegseth said, it's all really up to Donald Trump as to when this is over.
That's very interesting. And as we all know, Tehran's retaliatory attacks on United States assets in the Gulf region continue for a third day as fears of a prolonged conflict rise. Loud explosions were heard in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, and in the Qatari capital of Doha. How is the situation on the ground in these countries, and what does this tell us about the role the countries in the Middle East can play now, the security assessment in this crisis?
I think what we're seeing through Iran's strikes against its neighbors, particularly Arab neighbors, please note it did not attack Turkey or Azerbaijan, is that the objective is not to attack American assets or American interests in the region, because if it sought to do that, it would have gone well beyond the Arab world to Turkey and Azerbaijan as well. The objective they're
sorry for
trying to
interrupting.
achieve
There is
there.
no military base of the United States which is located in Azerbaijan and Turkey. It's a member of NATO as well. That's why, as it was also mentioned by some policymakers and experts in Iran, they are targeting the military base and military assets of the United States in a number of countries in the Gulf region. And they also advised those countries to close the military base in case they don't want the escalation on their territories.
Yes, I understand, but I don't think that's accurate that the strikes are just against American bases. We've seen that there have been strikes against the airport in Abu Dhabi. There's been strikes well beyond specific American interests. And there's clearly a objective that they could achieve by attacking Turkey and Azerbaijan. As I'm sure you know, the Öztürk base in Turkey, while it is under the control of Turkey, has been used for American interests. And Azerbaijan, with its close relationship with Israel, has been seen as an ally of their enemy. So clearly, if Iran's goal was to just lash out haphazardly, they would see Turkey and Azerbaijan as possible targets as well. The reason that they've had this specific type of strike against airports, American interests, the Strait of Hormuz, etc., is because their objective is to disrupt energy. They know they can't win through a conventional war. That's very clear. They've never, I think, claimed otherwise. What they do claim is that they have firepower, lots of firepower, and they can direct that firepower to disrupt the West as they see their enemy as a whole. And to disrupt the West, they would disrupt energy.
But the reality that while the Pentagon frames this as a limited operation aimed at degrading Iran's military capabilities, Iran is now responding across multiple fronts in the Gulf. And so at what point does limited deterrence fail and transition into open-ended strategic confrontation?
I don't think the Department of Defense or Trump has defined it as just degrading their military capabilities. When we talk about degrading their military capabilities, we need to understand that Iran does not engage in kinetic activity only through its military. It engages in military activity through its proxies, through its use of foreign influence operations, through its sale of oil, etc. So when we talk about things, we really have to understand the broader view of what's happening in Lebanon and in other countries, even as far as China. What's happening now affects China, affects Russia. Russia gains, China loses. So there's a lot going on here, and it's not when we talk about kinetic activity, military strength. We need to remember, war is diplomacy by another means. So we may be at war, but we're really still at diplomacy. This is not a war in the sense that we have boots on the ground yet, although I think the door is open for boots on the ground. And we saw that Trump specifically had said, asking the Iranian people to get out on the streets and take the air war to the ground against the regime.
As it was mentioned by Secretary Hegseth, he said that this is not a regime change war. Still, yet the supreme leader has been killed. Can you realistically separate military decapitation from regime destabilization?
When he says that, I think we have to parse that. We have to understand that he's speaking to a domestic audience as well as a foreign audience. So governments throughout the world, war departments throughout the world are watching that press conference for every little tidbit of information they can get. But also the American public is watching that. And there's no word more poison in America than forever wars and regime change. So just because he says it, that doesn't mean that it's actually true.
That's very interesting indeed. The secretary also refused to define a timeline and say the duration depends on President Trump. Does that indicate strategic flexibility or uncertainty?
It really, what's happening there is it's both, because clearly the American government wants to obtain as much as it can through this kinetic activity. However, having stated that, although there was a lot of planning that went into getting battleships into the area and securing its interests there and making sure that all American troops were ready, that doesn't mean, as we know, that there was necessarily a plan for how this would go, because there is a great deal of uncertainty with this White House and this president as to how things go. Iran is not Venezuela. In Venezuela, we know who the actors were very clearly. We had relations with many of them. It was something that was going on for many years. However, with Iran, it's a very different situation. While we may have had discussions, those discussions were not on the same kind of level as they were with Venezuela, nor did we have influence over the various actors in Iran the way we did in Venezuela. And we have a partner in this kinetic activity, which is Israel. Really, this is Israel's war against Iran. Israel has been, rattling these chains for many years. And as we know, the American government is somewhat beholden to Israel and its interests. And so part of that plays into this. This is not, we shouldn't believe that this is purely America's war against Iran. Iran hasn't really killed very many. I mean, what did Iran do to America? Beirut, almost 50 years ago. That was the last major activity against America, over 50 years ago. So if we're seeking now vengeance or some sort of justice for what happened in Beirut over 50 years ago, we've really taken a long time to get there. It's not credible to say this is America's war against Iran. This is really Israel's war against Iran, and Israel has an interest in making sure that Iran is destabilized or in chaos. So we don't really need to end this war in a clean way like we had sought in Iraq, although we didn't achieve that. A real goal here may be to not end the war and to leave it in a quagmire.
Hamdi, you touched a very important issue here, whether this war is between Israel and Iran or United States and Iran. We do know about so-called disagreements or difficulties in the relations between Israel and Iran, which lasted for, let's say, decades. But this war, the war of United States and Israel together while they are attacking the territory of Iran, started right now. Do you see there is a specific reason for this? Why Washington decided to do it, and why Donald Trump decided to start this war? What is the objective?
Okay, I don't think we can actually. We had assets that were working in order to conduct the regime change operation in Venezuela. Concurrent to that, the Iranian people were in the streets making the Iranian regime its weakest. If this was really part of a plan specifically to take down the Iranian regime that was planned well in advance and it was part of a broader strategy, we would have acted at that point. But Trump was busy in Venezuela at the time. This is still an ideal time to have conducted this kinetic activity because Iran is at one of its weakest points. But we shouldn't fool ourselves into believing that this wasn't anything but a war of choice, because only 7 months ago, we destroyed their nuclear capabilities. So they were not a threat. Iran hasn't killed any Israeli. When was the last time Iran killed an Israeli? I can't really recall any. Maybe by accident through some of its missile strikes in retaliation for missile strikes conducted by Israel. But it's so few and far between as to be, not significant enough to be a factor here. The fact is that this was a war of choice.
Another very important element, Washington says now that this is not an Iraq scenario, but if operations are ongoing and not limited to one-off strikes, how do you define the difference in practical terms?
Domestically, legally, there is no difference. What Trump has done is a violation of the Constitution. That doesn't mean that every congressman isn't happy to see Iran be attacked. However, there has been a violation of both international law and domestic law. Trump did not go to Congress to get an authorization to utilize military force against Iran. And this is clearly a war of choice. So there are some significant problems here because it wasn't a preventative attack. It wasn't preemptive by any definition of the word. We weren't under, a credible immediate risk from Iran. So there are a lot of issues here as to whether this is a legal attack, what the scope of the attack is. And it just, it's really too early to answer that question well, because we have so little information. You need to recall, Trump hasn't even really done a press conference on this. He made a statement in the middle of the night to announce the war as it was starting, but he's never taken any questions on this. And all that we really have is the one press conference today from Pete Hegseth. So there's a lot of lack of information at this point.
In any case, the war has started, and when it will be ended, no one knows. So how it can reshape the Middle East?
If this goes on, that there's an actual regime change, I think it's more about reshaping Iran than anything else, because Iran is not Persian. I think we have to start from that point. Iran is Persian, Ahwazi, Kurdish. There's even Azerbaijani people in Iran. You have South Azerbaijan. And what's going to happen is there's going to be a power struggle. And that power struggle isn't only going to be at an ethnic level. We have parties that have been seeking regime change in Iran since the revolution in 1979. So you have the MEK, you have Pahlavi, loyalists that remain in Iran to the current Iranian regime. So you have three parties there that are going to want to fight. And you have the ethnic divisions. So, to try to predict how this is going to turn out, I think would be impossible, other than to say there would be complete chaos if there is actually regime change in the polls. There's no possibility that this could end easily. The aim of Arab governments in the Middle East really should be to isolate themselves from what's occurring. Iraq is a different situation. You have a government in Iraq that is Shiite controlled, that has been loyal to Iran, that has suppressed the Sunnis to the point of demonizing them as terrorists, etc. And you have governments like Turkey and Azerbaijan on the border with Iran that have their own interests here.
So do you expect other countries to join this confrontation, the war, let's say, because we can hear some statements in the countries like the United Kingdom, the Saudi Arabia, even the regional actors do expect the enlargement, the scope of the conflict from the broader perspectives. And like the countries you previously mentioned, Russia and China, there were some statements, definitely they called for de-escalation, but there were not any active direct involvement from two of these actors who have their own interests in Iran. Therefore, if it's prolonged, what kind of scenario we should expect?
If this becomes a prolonged fight rather than a quick fall of the regime, every country is going to have to seek its interests. For example, we're going to see Israel try to create Balochstan. We're going to see Israel try to create Kurdistan in Iran. We're going to see literally every country try to assert its interests. We may even see Azerbaijan try to take South Azerbaijan. It only makes sense. we're going to see Turkey try to fight to prevent Kurdistan from being created in Iran. You know, the possible outcomes at this point are way too many to calculate.
Absolutely. But coming back to the energy and economy, how vulnerable are energy corridors and maritime choke points at this stage now, particularly the Strait of Hormuz, and what will be the immediate geopolitical consequences of disruption?
Well, this morning, Qatar announced that it is ceasing LNG production. Qatar is the world's #1 source for LNG production. So we've already seen that there's a substantial impact there. We also know that Iran has made specific attacks on the Strait of Hormuz, which is the most trafficked channel for energy in the world. So it's clearly going to cause energy prices to go up, which will put more money into the coffers of Russia, which will make China more in need of energy. China is one of the biggest users of energy today, and Iran supplies that energy to a large extent. So, you know, energy security is national security. You really can't separate the two. A country can't operate without some way to power everything. Its production facilities, to keep its people warm, to keep people fed. Energy is at the core of all of that. So, you know, this could very well become just a struggle over energy if the fight continues on, which would mean a of the Strait of Hormuz, and to prevent energy channels from transport corridors from being disrupted, which would be a very different focus from where the war is right now for the West, but the primary focus of the war for Iran. So that would mean that the West would be playing right into Iran's hands onto how this war wants to go. It would be a big red flag that Iran is actually prevailing in some perverse way in this conflict.
Well, Hamdi, and one more question I have. You are staying in Washington, D.C. in the United States. How you yourself feel the atmosphere, and probably there are some statements or analysis which may allow to, let's say, have more or less predictions about the future development of the scenario around United States, Israel, Iran escalation?
You know, everyone has something to say about everything. And in Washington, that's no different. So we've seen every kind of actor come out from every kind of little alleyway and corridor that you can imagine at this point. So we've seen MEK advocates coming out saying that it's a democratic organization rather than a Marxist Islamic death cult. We've seen people try to say that NCRI is not part of MEK. We've tried to see people say that Pahlavi is a sectarian because he doesn't want a Kurdish state or for Iran to be divided because he seeks unification. We've seen think tanks fall on every avenue of the spectrum, from, you know, the forever war narrative to the we must defeat this current threat to the United States. We've seen Democrats who have beat this drum about, well, there was no authorization for the war. We've seen Republicans who have said that, you know, Iran is a threat not only to the United States but to the world. We've heard everything here in Washington, and people have all kinds of interests here in Washington to say these things. I mean, that's a dangerous barometer to look at Washington to try to determine what's going to happen in a war zone, because there are more interests in Washington than you could count.
Well, Hamdi, thank you so much for joining Inside Politics today. Indeed, that was a very interesting conversation. Let's see what will happen next. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. So, what we are seeing now is a fast-moving and highly fragile situation. Military operations are continuing, political positions are hardening, and the risk of further escalation remains real. Much will depend on the decisions taken in Washington, Tehran, and regional capitals in the coming days. Whether this confrontation remains limited or expands further is still uncertain. My thanks to our guest today for his analysis. My name is Anastasia Lavrina. This was Inside Politics, and I see you next time.